I don't know when you're going to read this, but I can tell you when it started, I was out for a walk alone in the woods. When the entity came for me, it was beyond a blur. It was, for a lack of a better term, absence. Where it hid, there were no trees. Where it crept closer, there was no grass. Through the arc it leapt at me, there was no breeze of any kind. There was no air at all. As it struck me, I felt the distinct sensation of claws puncturing me somewhere unseen, somewhere I'd never felt before. My hands and arms, legs and torso seemed fine, and I wasn't bleeding. But I knew I'd been injured somehow. And as I fearfully ran back home as quickly as I could, I felt less. I was vaguely tired, and it was hard to focus at times. The solution at the early stage was easy. It was a big cup of coffee. It helped me focus and feel normal again. And for a while, the subtle drain on my spirit became lost in the ebb and flow of caffeine in my system. You could say my life kind of began that week. Actually, because that was when I met Mar. She and we got along great. Though, to be honest, I'm pretty sure I fell in love with her over the phone before we even met. It was almost as if the strong emotions of that first week made this thing fight back. It was still with me. I could feel it, latched on to some invisible part of my being. The first few incidents were minor, and I hardly worried about them. The color of a neighbor's car changed from dark blue to a black one morning, and I stared at it in disbelief before shaking my head and shrugging off the difference. 2 days later, at work, a coworker's name changed from Fred to Dan. I carefully asked around, but everyone said his name had always been Dan. I honestly figured I'd just been mistaken. Then, as ridiculous as it sounds, I was peeing in my bathroom at home when I suddenly found myself on a random street. I was still in my pajamas, pants down, and urinating, but now in a full view of at least a dozen people at a bus stop. Horrified, I pulled up my clothes and I ran before someone called the cops. I did manage to get home, but the experience forced me to admit that I was still in danger. The entity was doing something to me, and I didn't understand how to fight back. Mar showed up that night, but she had her own key. Hey, I asked her with confusion, to be admitted. How'd you get a key? She just kind of laughed, said I was cute. She asked if I was okay with this. She opened a door and entered a room full of boxes. She talked about living together being a big step, and especially when we've only been dating for 3 months. Living together. I'd literally just met her the week before. Thing was, my mother had always called me a smart cookie. I knew how to shut my yap and when to do it. Instead of causing a scene, I told her everything was fine, and then I went straight to my room and began investigating. My things were just as I had left them, with no sign of a 3-month gap in habitation, but I did find something out of the ordinary. The date. I shivered angrily as I processed the truth. This entity had eaten 3 months of my life. What the hell was I facing? What kind of creature could consume pieces of one's soul like that? I'd missed the most exciting part of a new relationship, and I would never understand any shared stories or in-jokes from that period. Something absurdly precious had been taken from me, and I was furious. The fury helped suppress the entity, I guess. I never imbibed alcohol. I drank coffee religiously. I checked the date every time I woke up. For 3 years, I managed to live each day while observing nothing more than minor alterations. A social fact here and there, someone's job, how many kids they had, that sort of thing. The layout of nearby streets, the time my favorite television show aired, that kind of thing. Always those changes reminded me that the creature still had its claws in me, sunk deep into my spirit. Not once in 3 years did I ever let myself zone out. One day, I grew careless. I let myself get really into the season finale of my favorite show. It was gripping, a fantastic story, and right at the height of the action, a young boy came up to my lounger and shook my arm. I was so surprised. I asked him who he was and how he got there, and he kind of smiled at me and laughed. He called me Dad. My heart sank in my chest. I knew immediately what had happened. After a few masked questions, I discovered that he was 2 years old, and that he was my son. The agony and heartache filling my chest was nearly unbearable. Not only had I missed the birth of my son, I would never see or know the first years of his life. Mar and I had obviously gotten married and started a family in the time I'd lost, and I had no idea what joys or pains those years contained. It was snowing outside. Holding my sudden son in my lap, I sat and watched the flakes fall outside. What kind of life was this going to be if slips in concentration could cost me years? I had to get help. The church had no idea what to do. The priests didn't believe me and told me I had a health issue rather than some sort of possession. The doctors didn't have any clue. Nothing showed up on all their scans and tests, pokes and prods, but they happily took my money in return for nothing. By the time I ran out of options, I decided to tell Mar. There was no way to know what this all looked like from her perspective, but what was I like when I wasn't there? Did I still take our son to school? Did I still do my job? Clearly I did, because she seemed to be none the wiser, but I still had a horrible feeling that something must have been missing in her life when I wasn't actually home or inside my own head. But that night, I set up a nice dinner in preparation. She arrived, not by unlocking the front door, but by knocking on it. I answered and found that she was in this beautiful red summer dress. She was happily surprised by the settings on the table. She made a joke about a fancy dinner for our second date, and she knew I was sweet on her. Thank the Lord, I knew when to keep my mouth shut. If I'd gone on about being married and having a son, she might have run for the hills. Instead, I took her coat and sat down for our second date. Through carefully crafted questions, I managed to deduce the truth. This really was our second date. She saw relief and happiness in me, but most assuredly interpreted that as dating jitters. I was just excited to realize that the entity wasn't necessarily eating whole portions of my life. The symptoms, as I was just beginning to understand, were more like the consequences of a shattered soul. The creature had wounded me, broken me into pieces. Perhaps I was to live my life out of order, but at least I would actually get to live it. And so it went for a few years, from my perspective. While minor changes in politics or geography would happen daily, major shifts in my mental location only happened every couple of months. When I found myself in a new place and time in my life, I just shut up and listened, making sure to get the lay of the land before doing anything to avoid making mistakes. On the farthest flung leap yet, I met my 6-year-old grandson, and I asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up. He told me he wanted to be a writer. I told him it was a fine idea. Then, I was back in month 2 of my relationship with Mar, and I had the best night with her on the riverfront. When I say the best, I mean the best. Knowing how special she would become to me, I asked her to move in. I got to live through what I'd missed the first go-around, and I came to understand that I was never mentally absent. I would always be there, eventually. When we were moving her boxes in, she stopped for a moment and said she'd marveled at my great love, as if I'd known her for a lifetime and never once doubted she was the one. That was the first time I'd truly laughed freely and wholeheartedly since the entity had wounded me. She was right about my love for her, but for exactly the reason she'd considered a silly romantic analogy. I had known her for my whole life, and I'd come to terms with my situation and found peace with it. It wasn't so bad to have sneak peeks at all the best parts ahead. But of course, I wouldn't be writing this if it hadn't gotten worse. The entity was still there, still gnawing at me. It had not wounded me and departed like I'd wanted to believe. The closest I could describe my growing understanding was that the creature was burrowing deeper into my psyche, fracturing it into smaller pieces. Instead of months between major shifts, I began having only weeks. Once I noticed that trend, I feared my ultimate fate would be to jump between times in my life, heartbeat by heartbeat, forever confused, lost. Only an instant in each time meant I would never be able to speak with anyone else, never be able to hold a conversation, never express or receive love. As the true depth of that fear came upon me, I sat in an older version of me and watched the snow falling outside. That was the one constant in my life. The weather. It didn't care who I was or what pains I had to face. Nature was always there. The falling snow was always like a little hook that kept me in place. The pure emotional peace it brought was like a panacea on my mental wounds. And I'd never yet shifted while watching the pattern of falling white and thinking of the times I'd gone sledding or built a snow fort as a child. I was startled a moment later when a teenager touched my arm. He called me Grandpa. He'd startled me out of my thoughts, and I wasn't as careful than usual. I asked him who he was. He half grinned, as if not sure whether I was joking. Handing me a stack of papers, he asked me if I could read it. He wanted to know what I thought. I asked him if he was pursuing the dream of being a writer, and he burned bright red. He was trying to, anyways. I told him to run off, and I'd read it right away. The words were blurry, and annoyed, I looked for glasses I presumably had for reading. Being old was terrible, and I wanted to leap back into a younger year, but not before I read this book. I found my glasses in a sweater pocket and began leafing through. Mar puttered in and out of the living room, still beautiful, but I had to focus. I didn't know how much time I would have here. It seemed that we had relatives over. Was it Christmas? A pair of adults and a couple of kids I didn't recognize tromped through the hallway, and I saw my son, now an adult, walk by with his wife on the way out the door. As a group, the extended family began sledding outside. Finally, I finished reading the story, and I called out for my grandson. He rushed down the stairs and into the living room. He asked me how it was. It was terrible. I told him the truth. It was terrible, but for all the right reasons. He's still young, so all of his characters acted young. But the structure of the story itself was solid. I didn't expect it to turn out to be a horror story. He nodded and admitted it was a reflection of the times. Expectations for the future are dismal and not hopeful like they used to be. I told him he was a bit too young to be aware like that. And an idea occurred to me. If he was into horror, does he know about strange creatures? He admitted that he read everything he could about things like that. He loved it. Warily, I scanned the entrances to the living room. Everyone was busy outside, and for the first time I opened up to someone about what was experiencing in my life. In hushed tones, I told him about my fragmented consciousness. For a teenager, he took it surprisingly well. He asked if I was serious, and when I told him I was, he donned this determined look of a grown man accepting a quest. He told me he'd look into it and see what he could find out. He also suggested I should start writing things down as I experienced them. Build some data. He wanted to map my psychic wound. It sounded like a plan, and I was actually kind of surprised. It made sense, and I wasn't expecting him to have a serious response. I asked him how he'd get my notes in one place, and he suggested we come up with a place for me to leave them. He can get them as time goes by, and we can trace the path that my life has taken and see if there's a pattern. For the first time since the situation had gotten worse, I felt hope again. My mind grew blank on places that I could place these notes. And then a thought occurred. Under the stairs. Nobody ever goes under the stairs. He nodded and agreed. He turned and left the living room. I peered after him, and I heard him banging around near the stairs. Finally, he returned with a box, laid it on the carpet, and opened it to reveal a bursting stack of papers. He exclaimed that... Well, I won't repeat what he said in good faith, but being a teenager, it was something offensive. Taken aback, I blinked rapidly, forgiving his cussing because of the shock. I asked him if I wrote those. He looked at me with wonder and said yes, or that I will eventually, and that I need to write down everything that I experience to maintain this amount and this detail. He also suggested I shouldn't see what they say, as things could get weird. I agreed. He informed me there was at least 50 boxes down there, and it'll take him a long time before he could decipher them. He joked, or I took it as a joke, but he told me, "I'll save you, Grandpa, because I don't think anyone else can." Tears flowed down my cheeks then, and I couldn't help but sob once or twice. I hadn't realized how lonely I had become in my shifting prism of awareness until I finally had someone who understood. I thanked him, heavily and heartily. And then I was young again, and at work on a random Tuesday. Once the sadness and relief faded, anger and determination replaced them. After I finished my work, I grabbed paper and began writing. While the weeks shifted around me, while those weeks became days and then hours, I wrote every single spare moment about when and where I thought I was. I put them under the stairs, out of order. My first box was actually the 30th, and my last box was the first. Once I had over 50 boxes written from my perspective, and once my shifting became a matter of minutes, I knew it was up to my grandson to take it from there. I put my head down, and I stopped looking. I couldn't stand the river of changing awareness any longer. Names, places and dates, jobs and colors, people were all wrong and different. And then, all of a sudden, I'd never been older. I sat watching the snow fall. A man of at least 30 that I vaguely recognized entered the room. He told me he had finally figured it out. I was so frail, and moving was painful. I asked if he was my grandson, and he nodded and said yes. He took me to a room filled with strange equipment and sat me in a rubber chair facing a large mirror twice the height of a man. The pattern, it finally revealed itself, he told me. And I asked him, "How long have you worked on this?" I asked, "Did you miss your life, like I'm missing mine?" His expression was both stone cold and furiously resolute. "It'll be worth it, Grandpa." He brought 2 thin metal rods close to my arm and then nodded at the mirror. "Look, this shock is carefully calibrated." The electric zap from this device was startling, but not painful. In the mirror, I saw a rapid, arcing-like silhouette appear above my head and shoulders. The electricity moved through the creature like a wave, briefly revealing the terrible nature of what was happening to me. A bulging, leech-like mouth was wrapped around the back of my head, coming down to my eyebrows and touching each ear, and its slug-like body ran over my shoulder and onto my very soul. It was a parasite, and it was feeding on my mind. My now adult grandson held my hand as I looked in horror. After a moment, he asked, "Removing it is going to hurt. Are you up to this?" Fearfully, I asked where Mar was. His face softened and told me that she was no longer here. I could tell from his reaction what had happened, but I didn't want to be it true. He told me we have this conversation a lot, and that it never makes me feel better when I find out what happened. Tears brimmed in my eyes. I don't care if it hurts or if I die. I don't want to stay in a time where she's not here." He made a sympathetic noise of understanding and then returned to his machines to hook several wires, diodes, and other bits of technology to my limbs and forehead. While he did so, he talked. He had worked on this for 2 years to figure this out, and he'd had a ton of help from other researchers of the occult. This parasite doesn't technically exist in our plane. It's one of the lesser spawns of an entity of which a name I could never pronounce, and it feeds on the plexus of mind, soul, and quantum consciousness and reality. When details like names and colors of objects changed, I wasn't going crazy. The web of my existence was merely losing strands as the creature ate its way through me. I didn't fully understand, and I still don't today, but I looked up in confusion, and he placed a circlet of electronics like a crown on my head, an exact line where the parasite's mouth had ringed me. I asked him what this strange other entity was, and he paused his work and grew pale. He had forgotten that I wouldn't know, and he told me I was lucky, and I believed him. After a deep breath, he began moving again and placed his fingers near a few switches. He asked if I was ready and informed me that it would tune my nervous system to an extremely unappetizing state for the parasite, but that it was basically electroshock therapy. I could still see Mars smile. Even though she was gone, I'd just been with her moments ago. He flicked a switch, and it echoed in my ears. I almost laughed at how mild the electricity was. It didn't feel like anything at first. And then I saw the mirror shaking, and my body within the image convulsing. It did hurt. Nothing had ever been more painful. It was just so excruciating that my mind hadn't been able to immediately process it. As my vision shook and fire burned in every nerve in my body, I could see the reflected, trembling light silhouette of this parasite on my head as it writhed in agony equal to mine. It had claws, 6-clawed, lizard-like limbs under its leech-like body, and it cut into me in an attempt to stay latched on. The electricity made my memories flare. Mars' smile was foremost, lit brightly in front of a warm fire as the snow fell past the window behind her. The edges of that memory began lighting up, and I realized that my life was one continuous stretch of experience. It was only the awareness of it that had been fragmented by the feasting evil on my back. I'd never managed to be there for the birth of my son. I'd jumped around it a dozen times, but never actually lived it. For the first time, I got to hold Mars' hand and be there for her. And then the moment shifted. I was still holding her hand, and she lay in a hospital bed, but for a very different reason. It was so merciless to make me remember this. I broke down, and nurses rushed into the room. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to experience this. I'd seen all the good parts, but I hadn't wanted the worst parts, the inevitable end that all would one day face. It wasn't worth it. It was tainted. All that joy was given back 10,000 folds as pain. The fire in my body and in my brain surged to sheer white torture, and I screamed. My scream faded into a surprised shout as the machines and electricity and chair faded away. Snow was no longer falling around my life. I was out in the woods on a bright summer day. I turned to see the creature approaching me. It was the same absence of meaning, the same blank on reality. It crept forward just like before, but this time it hissed and turned away. I stood, astounded at being young again and freed from the parasite. My grandson had actually done it. He'd made me an unappetizing meal, so the predator of mind and soul had moved on in search of a different snack. And then I ran home, and I was in a daze. And while I was sitting there processing all that had happened, everything, the phone rang. I looked at it in awe and sadness. I knew who it was. It was Mar, calling for the first time for some trivial reason that she'd admit 30 years later was made up just to talk to me. But all I could see was her, lying in that hospital bed, dying. It was going to end in unspeakable pain and loneliness. I would become an old man left to sit by myself in an empty house, his soulmate gone long before him. At the end of it all, the only thing I would have left, sitting and watching the falling snow. But now, thanks to my grandson, I would also have my memories. It would be a wild ride, no matter how it ended. On a sudden impulse, I picked up the phone with a smile and asked, "Who's this?" Even though I already knew.